going to cover today is something that the Department of Labor published over the summer with respect to best practices regarding cybersecurity. And, what they've done is they've really put a pretty comprehensive document together, as they always do, that really gives a lot of really good tips and actually gives you a roadmap for what you can do either as a plan sponsor or as a service provider or as a participant. They really hit those three areas. Today, we'll focus mostly on what I think you need to look at in terms of retaining service providers. But again, it's really a pretty comprehensive, multifaceted document, and it gives a very, very clear roadmap. But one of the things it also gets into is some of the fiduciary obligations that a plan sponsor would have with respect to protecting their retirement plan and protecting their participants, and really goes through what I think is a pretty nice checklist of to-dos, if you will. And it's not so much work, so to speak, on the plan sponsor side. It's probably more work for the service providers to respond to the various elements that a plan sponsor would be looking to check the box on to make sure that anything that's happening in a virtual environment is as secure as possible. Cybersecurity, cybercrime has been literally exploding, and we've got some facts and figures here in terms of what's really going on. It's expected to hit over $10 trillion worth of theft, if you will, by 2025. It's enormous. It's almost as big as the world's third largest economy, and more, quite honestly. And you can see the trend has just been on the up and up. The typical theft in the past was, probably, if you go back a number of years, a robbery, right? And, somebody coming in and strong arm and, give me the money. And, in this day and age, it's much easier to steal money electronically. And that's really what we're going to talk about this afternoon. And again, I think the DOL did a really nice job of putting together a comprehensive piece in terms of what you need to look at and what you should be concerned with. Ransomware is another big issue out there. That goes more towards the operational aspects of, a service provider, or even you as an employer. I read something recently that there was maybe not so much of a push, but at least a little bit of a talk of making payment of ransomware illegal. That is probably in the long run a good result to deter this kind of theft. In the short run, the first couple of businesses or service providers who get hit by it, if they're not permitted to pay ransom, it can actually be really, really detrimental to their operations unless they've got sufficient backup plans and the ability to go live in a separate environment from the one that was attacked. So, there's a lot going on in this space, a lot in this industry, and from what I understand, cybersecurity jobs are going to be in high demand, obviously, as we move forward in time. What we'll get into, they have an initiative, DOL has put an initiative in place, and this is going to be eventually part of their audit process of qualified plans, and even the audits they do of various service providers. They're going to be looking for things like, what have you done, right, as a plan sponsor to protect yourself and to protect your plan and protect your participants. And the roadmap here is actually pretty easy. I mean, there's a lot of details, but as I say, the details really are, the heavy lift, so to speak, is really on the service providers who would have to respond to your inquiry if you're a plan sponsor. So we'll get into all of this in just a couple of minutes. So, being a fiduciary of a plan is, a critical role that you would play as a plan sponsor. For those who have outsourced a portion of the fiduciary responsibility and role, and that's kind of a role we play for most of our clients, where we may be the ERISA 316 administrative fiduciary, or even a full fiduciary of the plan. A lot of this burden of making sure things are safe and secure would be on us as a fiduciary, if that's the role we're playing with your plan. But again, we still do a fair amount of business with plan sponsors where they act as their own fiduciary. So really, it's incumbent upon, I think, every plan sponsor to at least ask the question, which is really like, who's looking at this stuff and who's monitoring it, and making sure that you've made a best effort to do the best you possibly can. So some of the things that I just mentioned here is a fiduciary selecting and monitoring service providers. That is the Fiduciary Act. Decision makers as fiduciary, you've got to act prudently. That's always been the case. But again, as a fiduciary, you end up being liable, and it could be personal liability that you have if you're not acting in good faith and making a best effort. Being a fiduciary doesn't mean you have to be the expert. As I mentioned, many of our clients outsource some of the fiduciary obligations, some or all of the fiduciary obligations of their plan to PENTalk. But again, there are a lot that don't do that at this juncture. So I think it's important either way to at least be asking these types of questions. And there's a little bit of a dialogue here we've got on this slide talking about electronic delivery of plan information. So, that's something that some of you may or may not be doing in conjunction with us or whoever your service provider may be. But again, that's a critical responsibility. So what we're going to do is go through a couple of things that are critically important when you think about cybersecurity, in particular for your retirement plan. One is to have a formal means written and documented cybersecurity program. Another is to periodically conduct risk assessments. As an organization, we do this, I don't want to say all the time, but at least once a year, sometimes more frequently, in terms of hiring outside firms to do things like penetration tests and to help us identify any weaknesses that we may have in any of the security systems that are in place. And again, you as a plan sponsor, or even as an employer, are probably doing the same thing. But again, when I think about qualified plans, being prudent means not only taking prudent action, but also documenting what you've done. That's one of the critical things as a fiduciary. At some point, whether it's something as simple as a DOL or an IRS audit, or something even worse, which is an actual breach of some sort, but at some point you may have to prove that you've done your job, and documentation really is the key to that. Here I mentioned already third-party audits of security controls, critically important in most businesses today who do any sort of transacting online. Having a clear definition and assignment of security roles is critical. At Integra, we have a security officer that's backed up by a team of not only senior management, but really more of the information technology folks. And as I mentioned, outside firms who also come in and advise and consult in terms of best practices and making sure we're as up to date as possible with security protocols. Strong access control procedures is another thing. One thing that I see there that is kind of an easy trap to fall into, it's with departing employees, whether it's your organization or ours. One thing we do whenever an employee leaves is we make sure that their access to all of our systems, right, are closed off. We also make sure that all of their access to any of the providers or vendors that we use is also terminated and shut off. And that's reviewed in the various SOC audits that we go through each year, to make sure there's no gaps in that. And that whole process helps us update our procedures year over year, again, to make sure we're in charge and control of best practices here. And I assume a lot of you as a plan sponsor and an employer are taking the same approach. But again, having a plan in place, having a procedure in place, and making sure it's executed is critically important. Again, cloud storage is a big thing these days. And again, that's kind of getting into making sure there's an appropriate review, not just initially, but periodically, of any of those providers you may be using or relying on that are using any sort of cloud-based technology. It's critically important for those vendors and suppliers of services, that they're up to date and that they're using best practices at any and all times. So again, cybersecurity awareness training here at PENTalk, we do this. I can't tell you how much we do it. We do all sorts of things with our staff. We do phishing exercises that send an email that may appear to be from our HR department or may appear to be from our finance department, kind of directing or asking employees to, hey, click here to update your password, or, hey, you know what, there's a distribution due to somebody, can you please process, or, things of that nature. And we use that program in a way to, and by the way, we monitor it, right? We look at the clicks, we look at anybody who might click through, and to the extent that we have anybody who is kind of falling for those phishing emails, we go through an education process. We have continuous security training here. And again, many of you have the same procedures in place. But again, when you're talking about literally assets under management or advisement of billions of dollars, it's critically important to make sure that we're doing everything we possibly can to protect every plan and every participant that we do business with. This is kind of mentioned this before, having an effective business resiliency program, right? To the extent that you end up getting hacked or end up, with your systems down for, never mind cybersecurity, it could just be a hardware failure. So we have redundant capabilities in place here, which is good news. Over the last decade, we've seen enough situations where there was a power outage in like the entire Northeast. So we've got remote backup servers in different states that enable us to continue business with literally complete continuity. So, and again, not every one of you as a plan sponsor or a service provider for that matter may have that in place. But again, from our perspective, as somebody who deals a lot with online transactions and online viewing of critical data and information and money for that matter, we make sure that we have systems and procedures and backups in place for business continuity. This is a biggie. Encrypting sensitive data. It may sound simple, but it's I cannot tell you how often a client or a participant will send us, email us, PII, that is unsecure and unprotected. So one of the things we have in place, and I'm just kind of giving you some ideas as to what we do, we actually have software in place that, let's say there's a string of emails, and at the very bottom, right, the employee or the plan sponsor had some sensitive information. If one of our staff members tries to reply to it, 3 emails later, we have software in place that actually tracks that email and doesn't let it go out the door. So, encrypting data, obviously super critical from our standpoint in terms of anything that we send external. But again, we're cognizant of the fact that a lot of people just send us on, sensitive data unencrypted. And again, we have planned, procedures and software in place that helps us not fall into the trap of replicating that same error by sending it back out electronically in an unprotected manner. So just something to think about. And again, having controls in place and best practice in place is critical. And that's where the DOL went with this whole thing. It's there's a lot to think about, and sometimes you think, well, it's not that much to think about, but it really is. So they went pretty deep in terms of, what you need to do or what you should be doing to protect yourself and to protect your participants. And quite honestly, I think that document they put together does a really good job of not just affording you of a means of protecting people, but also a means of fulfilling your fiduciary role. in terms of checking all the right boxes, asking all the right questions. A lot of us are not super tech savvy. I totally get that. So this is really kind of a roadmap they put together that that helps quite a bit. So some of the things here on this slide for the registrars, set up and routinely monitor your account. This applies to plan sponsors, right, who might be checking our website for critical information on the plan, but it also applies to plan participants. So, whether you're a participant or a sponsor, it's an important thing to think about and look at. As a plan sponsor, it's also helpful if you remind your participants of some of these things. Some of the things here are pretty common. Most of us know about these types of things, multi-factor authentication. If you have an option, some service providers, right, give you an option of using multi-factor, using it or not using it. We and the DOL strongly recommend you enable multi-factor authentication. It's an additional layer of protection that would help you be more secure. I just read something about Apple's iPhone technology and software, that there was some breach or some open issue with their iMessenger system. There was a flaw basically where and it was a no-click kind of a flaw, right? Where somebody who somehow was could get into your phone and get into your text message system, if you will, and you didn't even have to open it or click on it. Just the fact that you got the text or whatever it might be presented the security breach. So I think Apple, they've corrected it, but that was just literally in the last couple of days that I heard about that one. So again, doing what you can, is critically important. Keeping personal contact info up to date. I just found one of my personal, I think it was a credit card account. I think it was a credit card account that had an address from like 2 addresses ago. And I'm like, wow, holy moly. I think I'd lost my password, and I was working with that vendor to try to get restored. And, they asked the information, tell me your address. Oh, no, that's not right. What do you mean it's not right? So keeping that information up to date is really, really helpful. There's all sorts of scams these days. I was actually the victim of a unemployment fraud in New York, where somebody 20 miles away had applied for unemployment benefits under my name. And somehow, they had the Social Security number. By the way, they made up an address in Yonkers, New York. Actually, I don't think they made up an address. I was able to actually search it and find it. It was a real physical address that they were hoping to get unemployment checks sent to. But our HR department shut that down pretty quickly. So all sorts of stuff go on in this environment today. So keeping your personal data up to date on everything that you deal with is critical. It's hard to do, right? Because we all have so many accounts out there. This one's obvious: close or delete unused accounts. Free Wi-Fi. For those of us who travel a lot in airports, it's something to be wary of. There are people who can kind of scrape your data and access your data if you're innocuously emailing or texting over a free, unprotected Wi-Fi network. We tend to use VPN systems. Don't even ask me what that means, so to speak, but basically secure systems of communication for those of us who are outside of the corporate environment. Phishing attacks, I mentioned that earlier. It's incredible. My wife just got an email today from her email provider email account saying, oh, you've got to, we're going to completely disable and delete your account unless you click here and reinstate. It's crazy. So, and they're getting pretty tricky. A lot of these phishing attacks look real. They've gotten better and better and better at that stuff. Antivirus software, firewalls, things of that nature are critical. And report events. We have a reporting system here that goes through our security committee, and it goes to all of us as senior management. And if anything arises that either is a breach or is something that was misdirected or whatever. There's immediate action that's taken on anything like that. So having a proper reporting channel and process. So here's where we start to get into some of the things the Department of Labor laid out. We should be asking service providers, any service provider you use, whether that's related to your retirement plan or just related to your business in general. You should be asking them these types of questions about the security protocols, practices, standards, audit results, so on and so forth, and ask them for audit reports. They'll release something. They may not release the full report, but they may release a letter from a third provider, third-party provider or consultant that did penetration testing that summarizes the results. So you should be asking that question. Ask how often how they validate and how often they validate their practices. Take a look at their security practices. We hear about incidents literally every day that many of us have been involved with, where data has been breached and passwords have been stolen and things of that nature. The good news is some of the software that we all use, that is, whether it's a Chrome browser or something like that. I mean, there are warnings that pop up on, when you log into your account that, hey, there was a security breach. Don't ask me how they do it, but they figured out they can do a pop-up almost instantaneously when you're logging in these days, right? That, hey, there's a breach and you ought to change your password as soon as possible. And it's not funny, but the thing about cyber crime is there could have been a breach yesterday where somebody grabbed some of your data, but that data may not be used for, who knows, a year or two or three. So, even though, there might not be any immediate impact to a breach of some service provider, there could be something down the road. So that's why it's critically important to update passwords, use strong passwords. That's a whole nother subject in and of itself in terms of coming up with a password that can't be tested and computer generated and just randomly hit upon. So there are ways to do that. Ask about past security breaches, right? That's something you should know about. And also ask about insurance policies. We've got pretty extensive cyber insurance coverage here for anything that might be beyond the scope of what we'd be able to manage. And what comes along with that is the ability to rely on those insurance companies that provide that coverage with kind of a team of people that would help resolve the situation. So there's not just the financial benefit, if you will, of the insurance, but there's also technical abilities and technical services that kind of come through if and when there was ever a threat, up to and including, credit monitoring and things like that if anybody was negatively impacted by something. So again, we're just going through some of the bullets here. I know we're trying to keep this to about a 35-minute presentation this afternoon. So I'm going to go through the bullets, and you can see that it's pretty extensive. So there's and Beth, I don't know, I think we put it in the documents that we're going to follow up with. The DOL pretty much came up with kind of a checklist of, and I think it's 12 or so critical questions that you should be sending those questions in writing. Email would be fine, to any service provider that you do business with. And hopefully, just like us, hopefully that service provider would be able to, basically respond affirmatively to each of those 12 items. But even beyond those 12 items, they've provided kind of in an RFI or RFP type of format, much more detailed questions that you should be sending to your service provider and expecting a response on. So I think the real critical takeaway here is, they've kind of mapped out a plan that's pretty easy to follow. It's not a lot of heavy lifting on anybody who's asking those questions. It's much more heavy lifting for the folks that have to respond to that.